Steal from the rich, give to the poor, a bow, a forest, a man in green. That's Robin Hood. Everyone knows this story. You probably learned it from a cartoon fox or a guy in tights doing a slightly embarrassing English accent. It's one of the most retold stories in the English language. There have been Robin Hood movies in literally every decade of cinema since 1908. But here's the thing. The version you know, noble outlaw, heart of gold, robbing corrupt officials to feed starving peasants, that version is give or take 400 years old.
The original Robin Hood is over 700 years old, and he is a completely different person. He's not a nobleman, he doesn't have a tragic backstory about lost lands, he's not particularly interested in the poor, and in the very first story we have about him, he kills 15 men in cold blood over a bet.
So, somewhere between the 1300s and now, somebody took a violent medieval criminal and turned him into a children's hero. And the question I actually want to answer today isn't who was the real Robin Hood. Nobody can answer that. He might not have even been one person. The question is, how does a society take a story like that and slowly, deliberately sand off all of its dangerous edges? And what does it tell us that we're watching that exact process happen again, right now, in 2026? Let's go back to the beginning.
Robin Hood didn't start life on a page. He started as something closer to a song you'd hear in a tavern. Historians think the character existed as oral storytelling. Ballads passed singer to singer as early as the 1100s or 1200s, 100 or more years before anyone bothered to write him down. And that detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Written literature in medieval England was by and large a tool of the literate elite, the church, the nobility, the court. Oral ballads belonged to everyone else. Robin Hood was, from the very start, entertainment for people who weren't supposed to have heroes of their own.
So, what did that hero actually look like once somebody finally wrote him down? The earliest substantial Robin Hood text we have is a poem called A Guest of Robin Hood. A guest just means a tale of adventure. It's a few thousand lines long, stitched together from older, shorter ballads, and historians date the underlying stories to sometime in the 1300s, even though the surviving printed version is from around the early 1500s.
And the Robin Hood in it is not who you think. He's described over and over as a good yeoman. Not a lord, not a knight, a yeoman, basically a free commoner, somewhere in social rank between a peasant and the gentry. No Earl of Huntingdon, no tragic noble lineage, no Robin of Locksley wronged out of his birthright. That entire backstory simply does not exist yet.
And he is violent. Not roguish violent, actually violent. In one of the earliest stories, Robin gets into an archery contest with the king's foresters, the armed men whose job is to enforce the king's hunting laws in the forest. Robin wins. The foresters refuse to pay up, and Robin's response is not a witty retort and a getaway. He kills all 15 of them.
That's not an isolated incident either. Across these early ballads, Robin Hood's merry men, a term that, by the way, doesn't even appear until centuries later, are a band of outlaws who rob, threaten, and sometimes kill their way through Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire. There's no Maid Marian in any of this. There's no Friar Tuck either. The earliest known mention of a Friar Tuck associated with Robin Hood comes from a play script from around 1475, more than a century after these stories were already circulating.
So, if you strip away everything added later, what you're left with is a free commoner, his armed gang, hiding in a forest, robbing and occasionally murdering corrupt church officials and royal officers. Robbing from the rich? Sure, sometimes. Giving to the poor? Barely mentioned. The defining feature of the original Robin Hood isn't generosity, it's defiance of authority. Full stop.
And this is where it gets genuinely strange. By the year 1300, which, remember, is before most of the written ballads even exist yet, English court records start using a phrase, Robehod, not as a name for one specific man, as a label, a generic term used by courts and clerks for any local troublemaker, any petty outlaw, any guy the community considered a menace.
Historians have found multiple real people with the actual first name Robert, nicknamed Hood, who get dragged into legal trouble across the 1200s and 1300s. There's a documented family from Wakefield in Yorkshire, active roughly between 1270 and 1340, with a long-standing local reputation for casual, brutal violence. Not folk heroes, not romantic bandits, the medieval equivalent of a violent local gang that everyone in town was scared of. Here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. It's entirely possible Robin Hood wasn't a person at all. It might have functioned more like a label that got attached to whoever the local outlaw happened to be that decade, the way Jack the Ripper became shorthand, or the way we might say some guy went full Joker, a folk archetype, not a biography, which means the question, who was the real Robin Hood, might be the wrong question entirely. The real Robin Hood might have been dozens of unrelated criminals, all absorbed into one increasingly famous name, because audiences wanted the name more than they wanted the facts. And once a name like that exists, flexible, popular, attached to nobody in particular, it becomes available to be reshaped into whatever the next century needs it to be. That's exactly what happened. Fast forward to the 1590s. Elizabethan England. A playwright named Anthony Munday writes two plays, The Downfall of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon, and The Death of Robert, Earl of Huntingdon. And this is the moment. This is the single biggest rewrite in the entire 700-year history of this character. Munday makes Robin a nobleman, specifically the Earl of Huntingdon, unjustly stripped of his title and lands by a corrupt rival, forced into the forest, where he becomes an outlaw, not because he's a criminal, but because he's been wronged. Think about what that change actually does. In the medieval ballads, Robin Hood's defining conflict was commoner versus authority, a free man going up against foresters, sheriffs, abbots, the entire machinery of feudal power. After Munday, Robin Hood's defining conflict becomes good nobleman versus bad nobleman. The class conflict doesn't just soften, it evaporates. The social order itself is never in question anymore. There's nothing wrong with having lords and peasants, the story now says. There's just an occasional bad lord who needs correcting by a good one. Why would an Elizabethan playwright make that change? Well, think about who's allowed to put on plays and who's watching them in the 1590s. England has a state censor, the master of the revels, whose entire job is approving or rejecting plays before they're performed. A story that glorifies a commoner taking up arms against the nobility and the church is, to put it mildly, not something you want to stage in front of paying audiences during the reign of an anxious, aging Elizabeth I. A story about a wronged nobleman restoring rightful order? That's safe. That's almost a celebration of the existing hierarchy. So the legend gets gentrified, not because anyone discovered new evidence about who Robin Hood really was, there wasn't any, but because a noble Robin Hood was politically convenient, and a commoner Robin Hood, the actual original, was not. This is the pattern I want you to notice, because it's going to repeat. Every major version of this story tells you less about the medieval forest and more about the century that's retelling it. Jump forward again to the 1800s. Victorian Britain takes Munday's noble Robin Hood and keeps sanding. The remaining violence gets softened into adventure. The remaining moral ambiguity gets ironed into chivalry. And this is the era where robs from the rich gives to the poor stops being an occasional plot detail and becomes the entire point of the character, his moral mission statement, his reason for existing.
Why the Victorians, specifically? Partly because this is an era obsessed with medieval romance generally, knights, chivalry, an imagined golden age of English honor, and partly because a Victorian audience, in the middle of an industrializing, deeply unequal society, was very receptive to a fantasy where a charming gentleman quietly redistributes wealth without ever actually threatening the existence of wealth, or lords, or the monarchy. Robin Hood becomes a pressure valve, a fantasy of fairness that requires nothing to actually change.
By the time the 20th century shows up with a film camera, the work is basically done. Errol Flynn in 1938, all swagger and green tights and zero genuine menace. Disney's animated Fox in 1973, and I cannot stress enough how perfect a choice that is. Symbolically, they didn't just sanitize the character, they made him a different species, an adorable cartoon animal, about as far from leader of a violent outlaw gang as you can possibly get. Kevin Costner in 1991, brooding and handsome, robbing Alan Rickman's deliciously evil sheriff of Nottingham. Every single one of these versions assumes the noble backstory invented in the 1590s. Every single one assumes the moral mission invented in the 1800s. Almost none of them have any idea, and definitely don't expect their audience to know, that the original Robin Hood was a yeoman who murdered 15 foresters over an unpaid bet. We didn't lose the original story. We replaced it, 1 century at a time, each version slightly more comfortable, slightly less dangerous, slightly more useful to whoever was telling it, until the replacement became the only version anybody remembered. Which brings us to right now. There's a film out in theaters today, June 19th, 2026, called The Death of Robin Hood, starring Hugh Jackman, directed by Michael Sarnowski, and it is almost defiantly not the Disney version. Jackman plays an aged, exhausted, violent outlaw late in his life, confronting the gap between the legend that's grown up around him and the things he's actually done. The film is explicitly based on an old ballad called Robin Hood's Death, not exactly Saturday morning cartoon material. Sarnowski has said in interviews that the film is, at its core, about the stories we tell ourselves and how we can't help cleaning them up for our children, which is almost word for word the exact mechanism we just spent 15 minutes tracing through Tudor plays and Victorian novels and Disney animation. He's not alone. A medievalist named Amy Kaufman, someone who spent years teaching the actual ballads in a university classroom, published a novel last year called The Traitor of Sherwood Forest, deliberately resurrecting the morally compromised, dangerous Robin Hood of the original sources. Her own words, "It's a Robin Hood who isn't 100% a good guy, not even 50%. So why now? Why, in 2026, are we suddenly so interested in unsanitizing a 700-year-old outlaw? Here's a theory. Over the last few years, you've probably noticed the phrase Robin Hood getting attached to real, modern, very controversial figures, vigilantes, vengeful folk-celebrated criminals, people the internet half-jokingly, half-seriously starts comparing to a noble outlaw within hours of a headline breaking. It happened, notably, around the killing of a healthcare CEO in late 2024, when commentators reached almost instinctively for Robin Hood as a frame. That comparison should make you a little uneasy, and I think that's exactly the point. Because if there's one thing 700 years of this legend teaches us, it's that Robin Hood was never really a record of what one man did. It was always a vessel for whatever a given audience desperately wanted to believe about defiance, about fairness, about who deserves to be called a hero. A violent criminal gets the label slapped on him in 1300, and 300 years later he's a wronged nobleman, and 200 years after that he's a cartoon fox teaching kids about charity. The myth was never stable. It just looks stable in hindsight, because we only ever see one frozen version at a time, the version our own century happens to be running. So, who was the real Robin Hood? Honestly, wrong question. There might have been one man, There might have been a dozen, all folded into a single convenient name. What's verifiably true is this: somewhere in medieval England, the idea of an outlaw who defies the powerful struck such a nerve that people couldn't stop telling stories about him, and every generation since has felt entitled to edit those stories until they said what that generation needed them to say. Monday needed a safe nobleman. The Victorians needed a polite redistributor of wealth. Disney needed a fox kids could watch on a Sunday afternoon. And maybe this year, we need permission to admit that our heroes were always a little more violent, a little more complicated, a little less innocent than the cartoon version let on. Which leaves one more question, and it's the one actually worth sitting with. If it took us 700 years to even notice we'd sanitized Robin Hood, what are we sanitizing right now, today, in real time, that somebody 300 years from now is going to have to dig back up and call the dark, violent, forgotten truth?